Hello there again from Agrc 222 Introduction to Veterinary Science. This is Unit 15, where we are briefly going to discuss parasitology. We've referred to parasite issues a number of times throughout the semester and in quite a few of the units, and maybe not covered it in quite enough detail, and that will be conducted here in this kind of wrap-up section here as we finish up the course. So when we talk about parasitology, just a few introductory basic facts. From an economic impact in the industry, it's mostly in young stock, but we lose somewhere estimated between $10 and $12 billion in lost revenue each year due to parasite issues. Complete control is nearly impossible. There's really not a way to 100% eradicate its risk, and that almost doesn't matter what production system or species that you're talking about. You're going to deal with parasite risk in some form or fashion. So mitigation and understanding of the disease cycles and the risk factors is really what's crucial into managing this problem. We're going to break out and talk about two different parasite categories: ectoparasites that live on the body exterior, like flies and ticks, and then, of course, endoparasites, which are your internal pests that we have to worry about from a number of different ways. So let's focus first on ectoparasites. Of course, we can talk about just very simple damage to and irritation to the skin, which maybe on the surface is not that big of a problem, but of course we can have really significant hide damage. We can have permanent scarring. We can have issues where we create kind of surface spots for infection. So there's a number of different things that can happen. Not to mention that those ectoparasites can transmit infectious organisms and cause other types of disease that those pests may be carrying. Most of the time when we talk about ectoparasites, it's just simple restlessness, some nervousness or excitement that may be problematic with the animal. And of course, they obviously are very common to suck blood, like we talked mosquitoes and flies. Endoparasites are the ones that we're probably more likely to be very concerned about because we will not as often or as easily observe their infestation. And most of the time they affect the host animal because they absorb nutrients intended for the host. So they will be kind of situated somewhere within the body in one of the major organs, not just digestive. They could be lungworms, they could be heartworms, they could be roundworms, and they can migrate among the different organs and cause blockages and all kinds of different problems. But primarily they rob very valuable nutrients and circulation from the animal, and can cause internal bleeding, malnutrition, and then of course death. So how would you know if you had internal parasite issues? What would you be looking to observe with in terms of signifiers that you may have an endoparasite problem? Typically, it's signified by one or a combination of these 8 different things that are listed here. And there's a few more, but this gets the major components of them. Number one, they may have poor appetite. They may be off feed. They may be dehydrated for no particular reason. General unthriftiness, and sometimes you say, what does that mean? That's usually tied to a rough hair coat. But, unthrifty could be kind of a dull look in their eye, kind of droopy ears, obviously some atypical stool or atypical bowel movements. They may have full-on diarrhea. They may have periods of weakness. They may have continual weakness or listlessness, slower gains and slower growth rates, and certainly weight loss could be problematic. But you may see one or a number of these different symptoms among others that could develop. So how do you go further in detecting internal parasites? Well, the first thing is to take a stool sample and do a fecal smear, where you just take basically a sample of fecal material and smear it across a slide, put it under the microscope, and then observe for those larvae. or pieces of larvae. And that works okay. But the flotation method is much more common and actually much more effective. And so again, you take a stool sample and you float it. You actually irrigate it with saline solution, and the eggs, as you irrigate it, will float to the top. And so you can put this in a beaker or a test tube, and as you're irrigating it and kind of mixing it all at the same time, you'll fill the container all the way just to the brim of the test tube, and let that saline solution just before it would happen to run over those eggs. You won't be able to really see them with the naked eye, but the eggs will float out of that fecal sample, and so then you just have to touch a slide to the top of that test tube or container, turn it over and put it on a microscope, so you're in effect catching the eggs on the microscope slide. And that's the best method of detection. And actually, since the eggs will then be in water, you can much easier see the eggs problematic on the microscope slide. Life cycle, and I understand that I have a bunch of different numbers here. Generally, when we talk about different life cycles of parasites, whether they're ecto or endo, the life cycles might be slightly different. But of course, we start on the outside of the animal with step 1. And if we're talking about ectoparasites, they penetrate the body, causing tissue damage. If we're talking about endoparasites, they probably are ingested through feed or in the pasture somewhere. They hatch, mature, reproduce, shed more eggs. It goes back onto the pasture. They may be consumed by an intermediate host, or may stay on the pasture for an indeterminate, or in the feed area for an indeterminate amount of time. So we may have that intermediate host. That's possible, and it may migrate within the host. That is also possible, but not necessarily every single worm does that. So you have to be aware of the different life cycle risks that you have whenever you're mitigating parasite problems on your operation. So how do you control them? Again, remembering that we can't just full-on eradicate them ever, but we do need ways to control them. Number 1, simple, proper nutrition. Keep your animal's diet, whatever animal that we're talking about, properly balanced, proper protein, energy, vitamins, minerals, that will keep them on a high health plane. Prevent overstocking, and that is true when we're talking about any confinement operation or on a pasture, whatever it may be. The proper amount of animals per space will keep grazing rates at the proper level and keep them from grazing much closer to the ground. Rotate pasture and prevent overgrazing. I have horses in the picture here. If you allow horses to really graze a pasture, they'll graze it basically down right to the dirt. The closer that they get to the soil line, the more likely that you will have parasite problems. If you rotate them out to other pasture areas, then you have a less risk because the eggs tend to stay much closer to the soil line. Proper sanitation, that goes for any of your facilities, indoor or out. And then use deworming products regularly and rotate them so that you hit different potential worm risks. So that's your 5 best methods of controlling parasitic problems. So that wraps up this section. I hope you've enjoyed our brief little conversation here on parasitology. And then, of course, I hope you've enjoyed the course and picked up a few different great things and are aware of what strategies you might need to employ to control diseases in your favorite species. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this semester.